This is Miss Evelyn. Today we are going to discuss the first lesson in LPW or 21st Century Literature from the Philippines and the world. Our lesson for today is Introduction to Literature. For our lesson objectives, we have the following. By the end of the lesson, the students will be able to familiarize themselves with the basic context of literature, which includes the definition of literature, its characteristics, as well as its purpose, and then to enumerate the importance of literature. And our lesson for today will also focus on answering the question, what is the meaning and purpose of literature? Before we formally begin with our discussion of the lesson, I want you to think about this. Whether you are aware of it or not, you have been exposed to literature your whole life. Maybe even before you were taught how to read or to write. Like, for example, through stories read to you by people around you when you were a child, and more so in your everyday life now, where there are various types of literature available. Through these exposures, surely you may already have a personal notion of what literature is. And so, what I want you to do now is to pause this video for a while and, in your own words, briefly think of how you would define and describe literature. And then later on, compare your own definition to what will be discussed in the lesson. Okay? So literature, or the art of written, sometimes performed words, has been around even before most humans can read or write. Like even before we have a formal form of writing with pen and paper, we've already been telling our stories. And these stories may be that of personal experiences or of others. And as Moody in 1987 puts it, literature springs from our inborn love of telling a story, of arranging words in pleasing patterns, and of expressing in words some special aspects of our human experiences. So even before we are able to write down stories formally, we already have this inborn or innate love for sharing experiences by sharing personal stories to people. And even if we don't like reading, or even if we don't like reading books or novels, we do love telling stories. And these stories may not be fictional stories, but of personal experiences or experiences of other people. And aside from that, we also have an inclination or tendency to express ourselves, our emotions, our thoughts, and feelings through the use of words. And not just plain words, but words that are arranged in pleasing patterns and words that were carefully chosen to be able to express different human experiences. So this particular description of literature by Moody shows us how literature is actually present in our everyday lives. That even if we don't explicitly say that we are doing literature or that we enjoy literature, we are already doing it as a matter of fact. But a holistic definition of literature could be that it refers to a body of written works produced in a particular language, country, or age about a particular subject or object. So with this particular definition, it shows us that literature could be a part of a culture or of a country's identity, and that every country, if not most country in the world, and culture in the world would have their own literary forms, and that these literatures could be included in the identity of these countries and cultures. Like, for example, in the Philippines, we've had literatures that shaped the values and beliefs of people in a particular time in our history. We've had novels that became foundation to people's beliefs and to people's want for change. So that means that literature is more than just written words. Literature is more than just stories told by authors or poems written by poets, but it is actually a part of an identity of a country or a culture, or an extension even of a person's personal belief or values. But we also have to take into consideration the fact that literature is not always a written work, because this definition showed us that literature is a body of written works, especially now in the 21st century, and actually in the early times, literature started as an oral tradition, meaning to say, before we've had the pen and paper and the formal way of writing, we are already expressing ourselves through words in different forms of literature. So it covers both oral and written forms of works which manifest expressive and imaginative quality, of timelessness, of nobility of thoughts, and universality. So these things are what we consider as just some of the characteristics that a good literature must have. And then later on in the lesson, we'll actually discuss them more. Okay? But as a form of art, literature encompasses many different subgenres and ways of expressing it, from written to performed, and even with the incorporation of different media, especially now at present, wherein we get to incorporate stories, or we get to perform poems and dramas in many different ways through the use of advanced technology. Another definition of literature, according to Gyasi in 1973, is that literature is anything that is written. This particular definition of literature, for me personally, is very vague and broad. Because if we say that literature is anything that is written, then that means that everything that we see in our environment that has a written word on it could be considered as literature. Take, for example, the billboards that you see every day on highways or in the streets, the advertisements posted on trees or bulletin boards that would bear written words. Those, according to Gyasi, could already be considered as literature. Furthermore, if you go to the grocery, for example, all the labels and the racks and even the written words behind the bag of a potato chip is already considered as literature, according to Gyasi. So I think that it is important that we are able to discriminate which among such written text is good literature or not. Because, for example, if you have a bag of potato chip in one hand and a novel in another, if you are going to look at the written words in each object, would you say that they are both literature? According to Gyasi, they are. But for me personally, we have to be able to discriminate which of the two is true literature. And one way to help us know which of these is a good literature and which is not, we have what we call literariness. Literariness is defined as the artfulness of literature which makes a literary text different from other types of writing. So meaning to say, for something to be called a good literature, or for a written text to be considered as a good literature, it must possess literariness. So literariness, furthermore, highlights or involves apt use of literary devices, techniques, and figurative language in their careful shaping of elements of a literary text to communicate a point or insight. So for a written text to be considered as good, it should be able to use or highlight the author's use of literary devices and different writing techniques. So in short, it should have a level of creativity. It should highlight aesthetic characteristics of a written text and elevate its quality or value. So for this reason, we can be able to classify then which written texts possess certain literariness or not by differentiating between literature versus literature. So looking at the two words, they're almost identical. At first glance, you would say that there's not much difference between them, save for the difference in the first letter of the two. So the former starts with an uppercase L, while the latter has a lowercase l. So this is because it actually represents and emphasizes what is true and good literature with what is not, or with what is a written work that has a high level of literariness and a written work that has lower literariness or no literariness at all. So let's try to see how they are different from one another. So first, let's start with the literatures belonging to the first type, or the literature with capital L. So we can say that this refers to writing that is inventive and literature of artistic value. So written works that would be very creatively written by authors, and written works that would have creativity in the use of words, in the use of literary devices, as well as writing techniques and narrative techniques, those could be considered as literatures belonging to the first type. Furthermore, books or written literatures that has what we call lasting value are also considered as literatures having the uppercase L. So when we say lasting value, it means that it expresses ideas of permanent and timeless interest. So meaning to say, even if it was written in the earliest time or in the previous century, when read today, it should still be relevant to the people, no matter how old the book is, or no matter how long the story had been written. And furthermore, it should also express ideas of universal interest. When we say universal interest, on the other hand, it means that no matter where the story was written, no matter how different the culture was or is of the author from the readers, and even the language it was originally written in, it should still be relevant to the people or to the person reading it. Like for example, Many of us Filipinos enjoy reading books, or specifically novels, written by foreign authors coming from the Americas or Europe, for example. And even though these stories were set in a foreign place or in a place that is far from our local environment, we can still relate to the story and we still enjoy reading them because the characters were written in such a way that the readers are able to relate with their experiences. So, apart from the setting of the story, we can relate to the written text because it has a relatable character, it has a relatable theme, and a timely message. So, literatures, to be considered as literature with capital L, they should be universal in theme, universal in message, and it should go beyond physical environment. And it should be able to touch people from or coming from different cultures and background. And then lastly, literatures with capital L are also meant for serious reading. So meaning to say, when we read literatures belonging to this type, we really want to focus on what is happening in the written text. We want to analyze what it is about, and we want to understand what it means and how it is relevant for us. Some examples of literatures belonging to this type are fictions, creative non-fictions, poems, and drama. Okay? So those are the characteristics of the first type of literature. Next, let's compare it now to the second, the literatures with the lowercase l. So literatures with the lowercase l are considered as everyday literature. Everyday literature because we encounter them in our daily life. So take, for example, the one I mentioned earlier, the billboards, the bag of potato chip, the instructions in a manual for a TV remote, for example. Those are written texts that we experience or that we encounter in our everyday lives. And since these are written texts that we mostly encounter in our normal and daily life, naturally, they would not have a lasting or permanent and universal value. So, meaning to say, if we are going to read these written texts now, they may not be relevant anymore in our life later on because these written texts would not have a permanent value to it. And then, it's also meant to entertain or be read as a pastime and to divert our attention as well as to inform. So if we compare it to the one earlier, wherein it is meant for serious reading, literatures belonging to this type are more on about entertainment, about diverting attention, and to simply just inform a person about something. Examples of books or written texts that belong to this particular type are advertisements, newspapers, cookbooks, diet and travel magazines, technical journals, and many more. So just think of anything that doesn't really have creativity with it, or that doesn't have a timeless theme or message. Those are considered as literature belonging in the second type. Okay, so once again, these are the two types of literature in terms of its level of literariness, either it has a high level of literariness, or that it has lower level of literariness, or none at all. Okay? Next, let's move on to the characteristics of literature. So literary texts come in many forms and may feature various themes and values. Authors enjoy the freedom to express their writing in any language using any features of style that they feel will best bring out their story. However, it is important to note that no matter how different these literary texts are, they should have the following characteristics for them to fit the bill of good literature, or for them to be considered as literature with high value of literariness. So first characteristic is that literature is said to be an art. So why is that so? Literature is considered an art form in and of itself, since it is oftentimes a product of an imaginative and creative process. Just like what we said earlier, written texts, especially those with a high value of literariness, would have a quality of having creativity, or being written with much creativity in terms of the use of words and different writing techniques. And furthermore, its use of structure and various elements would focus on bringing forward the aesthetics of a literary text. When we say aesthetics, it pertains to beauty. Beauty in the form of the words used in the text, beauty in the form of how the story unfolds, beauty in the form of the overall quality of a text. And so, if a literature would have the following, then we can consider it as a form of creative writing, because so much creativity were needed to be able to finish or to do a particular literary text or a piece of literature. Next, we also have the second characteristic. Literature is expression. So when someone writes down or performs a piece of literature, they impart a portion of themselves onto the text. And just like what we mentioned earlier, we as human beings, we have an innate tendency to express ourselves through writing. And through literature, we are able to reflect our personalities, emotions, styles, beliefs, and psyche of either an individual or a group of people. So through literature, in this sense, becomes a medium to express and reflect one's personalities, emotions, styles, and beliefs. Furthermore, literature as an expression responds and connects with what we call as the affective or emotional side of human beings. The need to share something, the need to express our emotion towards a person or towards an issue or a topic. And by doing so, we are able to impart a portion of ourselves onto the literature that we create. And we can say that whenever we create, for example, a poem, it becomes an extension of ourselves, because we are able to pour some part of ourselves onto that written text. Next, literature is mimetic. So if you're not familiar with the word mimetic, it comes from the Greek word mimestai, which means to imitate something. So the mimesis of literature, or literature is mimetic when it is able to mirror reality, nature, or life. So the character's attitude, for example, their mannerisms, the conflicts that they encounter, and the overall situation that they are in should be familiar to the reader's world. That's why whenever we read a story, and whenever we like the narration or the story itself, it means that we are able to relate to either the character, we see ourselves in them, their attitude or mannerisms, or we are able to relate with their conflicts or struggles. So literature is mimetic because according to Aristotle, art should be able to mirror, or good art at that, should be able to mirror reality, nature, or life. So what is happening in nature, what is happening in real life, are also happening in literature. So in a sense, it reflects a social or individual identity or belief, a history, or a culture. Okay? And the next, literature is didactic. So didactic means value-laden or full of values. So meaning to say, or this tells us that good literature should impart, teach, and develop values. After reading or witnessing a piece of literature, the readers must be able to gain something of value from it to make their experience meaningful. So that after reading a text or after watching, for example, a drama, they must be able to take away something from it, either be it a learning, a new learning, or a realization. Okay? And then lastly, literature is a criticism of life. So as literature mirrors life and reality, it provides an objective base for understanding of life. So as we see reality mirrored in our literature, we also get to have a foundation or a basis for us to understand life better. And as Baldic in 2009 said, through literature, we get to interpret the meaning of nature and life. Because, according to him, literature consists of writing which interpret the meanings of nature and life. So, if we're able to see that in literature, this interpretation then will also allow us to be critical of the reality we are in, and which could also be a chance for change. So this happened, for example, take the novels of Dr. Jose Rizal as our example, El Filibusterismo and Noli Me Tangere. It played a very vital role in our Philippine history, especially during the Spanish colonization period, when it was published by Dr. Jose Rizal. So it is actually a mirror of what is happening to the Philippines during that time. So it narrated how the Filipinos are slowly being alienated in their own country by the Spaniards. And it showed the hypocrisy of some people and the corruption in the government and the dark reality of that time. So this particular literature, because it mirrors so much of what is happening in the reality, it then became a spark for the people during that time to revolt against what is happening and to do something about it. So that particular literature was able to be critical of the reality that the people were in during that time, and by doing so, it was able to spark change among people. So that is actually how powerful literature can be. That it is beyond, or it is more than just written work, or it's more than just a written text. Because when read by people, and that when it inspires people after reading it, it could transform people's lives and even the whole nation. So literature is a good vantage point for us to critique life and to try and see what are some things in our society that we could change. Okay, so those are again the characteristics of literature. Next, we have the functions of literature. This is actually the last part of the discussion. So literature, as a product of human experiences and culture, also has its own functions. Firstly, the ancient Greek writer Horace, if you still remember Horace, believed that one of the functions of literature was twofold. That is, to teach a moral lesson, but also to entertain an audience. He encapsulated this in the Latin phrase dulce et utile, or dulce et utile, meaning, or which translates to sweet and useful. This means, or if put in the context of a literary piece or a literary work, this means that literature must not only be able to satisfy a creative pleasure, but also be of service to the readers as well. So meaning to say, it should not only be well written, but it should also be able to impart something with the readers or to the readers. Okay, so that's the first purpose. And then lastly, literature also allows for what we call as catharsis. So when used in literature or in the context of literature, catharsis is the release of emotions. Is the release of emotions such as pity, sadness, and fear through witnessing art. So catharsis involves the change of extreme emotion to lead to internal restoration and renewal. The writer, by expressing a piece of themselves into the literature they write, are already translating their emotions into writing. Just like what we said earlier, whenever we write a piece of literature, we impart a piece of ourselves onto that literature, or it becomes an extension of ourselves. Or for example, just like Voldemort with his Horcruxes, our literatures that we write also becomes our Horcruxes, a part of ourselves. So these emotions that were imparted by the author onto their writing will then be experienced by the readers as they read the text. So in short, literature must be able to allow a release of emotions, not just from the readers, but also from the writers as well. So that the release of emotions are also twofold. One, to the reader, and the other one, to the writers themselves, because they were able to translate it onto their writings. Okay? So in summary, literature is an art form that expresses and communicates thoughts, feelings, ideas, attitudes, and other human aspects towards life and the world. It has various characteristics and functions, but above all, It must be aesthetically satisfying, intellectually stimulating, and spiritually uplifting. So that ends our discussion of the first lesson in LPW. Thank you for listening and see you on the next one.